Hello and welcome back to the Health Fridge podcast. I'm your host, Holly B. Today, I welcome back Andrea Marshall. Andrea Marshall is a positive psychology expert who traditionally uses the positive psychology model within the corporate environment, helping project professionals lead better project outcomes and achieve greater success in those areas. For our conversations, we are talking about positive psychology as it pertains to life in general. How can you use the positive psychology model to live a happier and more fulfilling life as opposed to one that's stuck more in the victim mindset of things happen to me and not for me? So, we had such a great conversation in our first episode and got such great feedback on it that I asked her to come back on, and we're going to be doing some short, small segments over the next several months to lean into the topic of cognitive biases. We touched briefly on that within the first episode, so I'll have that episode linked at the bottom in the show notes. So I encourage you to go back and listen to that first episode to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about moving forward. And I just want you to come to this with an open mind, like always, to see where you might actually be stuck in a cognitive bias that you didn't even recognize. We all have them, we all do it. They're not all bad either. And we're going to talk about that with Andrea today. And so, with that, I hope that you enjoy this episode. Andrea Marshall, welcome back to the Health Fridge podcast. I'm excited actually to take the conversation we started in our first episode together, which was all about positive intelligence, and continue down that pathway. We had been talking a little bit about cognitive biases, and we were talking after we recorded last time and thought it would be really interesting to have some short segments to tease out what these cognitive biases are and find out which ones we might be stuck in and how we can recognize that and move through them a little bit better. So, welcome back and dive in. Let us know what cognitive biases are.
Excellent. Thanks, Holly. I am delighted to be back. And cognitive biases, for starters, cognitive biases are a particular area of interest to me. I'm so fascinated by the way our brain works and how it helps us and hinders us and does all the things it does. I'm fascinated by cognitive biases in a lot of ways because it's related so much to decision making and how we decide about things throughout our days and as we navigate various challenges in our world. And there have been studies and lots of things that people say about some of these studies, but studies that say we actually encounter and make up to 35,000 decisions a day. Now, some people have said, okay, well, if you sleep for 2 hours and you divide that up, that's roughly a decision every 2 seconds, which seems like an awful lot. And how did anybody ever count that? But as we think about the way we go through our days, we wake up and we have to make a decision. Am I getting out of bed or am I staying in bed? Do I hit the snooze button? Do I not hit the snooze button? And then what am I going to wear? And what am I going to eat? And am I going to choose this thing or that thing? So really, we're constantly making decisions throughout the day. And our brain likes to create neural pathways that help us make those decisions automatically and easily. And we leverage this capacity when we do habit change. So cognitive biases sometimes will determine, like, this habit serves me, right? Like the habit of brushing my teeth every day. One of my favorite references, because we can all relate so well. It serves me. But maybe I have a habit of picking up my phone first thing and playing a video game. And then all of a sudden 20 minutes disappears. And I'm like, oh, well, this habit maybe isn't serving me as well as it could. And I could maybe do something different with my time. And so cognitive biases are one of the ways we help navigate what we're going to put our attention on and what we're not, and how we're going to parse out all of those decisions. And the word bias is interesting because it tends to carry this sort of negative connotation or negative weight, that is more cultural. Like, we're not talking about cognitive biases being bad or good. They're neither. They just help us make some decisions. And so I would really encourage people to maybe let go of those labels or those judgments of good and bad and just look, how are we showing up? How are we making decisions, and do these decisions serve us? So there are up to, depending on who you talk to, as many as 180 cognitive biases that we work with. And I look forward in the weeks and months ahead and at further future episodes to dig into some of those sort of individually. But I think it's helpful to get us all on the same page of what is a cognitive bias. And it is very much a belief, a way that we've come to look at the world that our brain uses to help us navigate with so much information coming in through all of our senses all the time. What am I going to pay attention to? Where do I really need to turn my time and attention? And then how am I going to make choices throughout the day?
You had shared with me a video, a TED Talk, to highlight some of the cognitive, like how cognitive bias works. And I was listening to it just before we got on recording, and you said, "Oh, wasn't that a great video?" And I said, "Well, yes, but it also really pissed me off because it's calling me out, you know?" We're all called out when it comes to these biases. It's like, I understand there are cognitive biases. I recognize that they play a role, but I, knowing that, still want to believe that my biases are the right biases. So how do we like start to navigate that process? How do we become aware of our own biases and where we might need to open our minds just a little bit to see that there could maybe, just maybe, be some other possibilities out there?
Mm-hmm. Hey, I think awareness is a tricky thing, right? Like, once the box is open, you can't close it anymore. But oftentimes we do get new information, and our first thing is resistance, right? So we have a little bit of egocentric bias that says my way of looking at the world is the right way of looking at the world.
Obviously.
And why wouldn't we, right? Because we live in this skin, we live in this space, we look at the world with our eyes, and we come to it with our experiences and all of the sort of things that we've learned along the way. And so it's like, well, yes, I'm amazing. Until we encounter some new information that's like, that's really interesting. And that's where we can start to think about, well, why do I have this belief or this thought? Or why do I look at the world this way? You and I are both entrepreneurs, right? And I think about a past time where I've known people who, and I still have friends who absolutely believe like financial security is the most important thing in the world. And the way you do that is through paid employment. And so who would ever leave paid employment to attempt to go off and do this other thing? And for them, like, that is absolutely a belief. And they don't really quite understand the entrepreneurial mindset, where folks who have entered this entrepreneurial realm and get to work in a very different way. Your day looks very different. My day looks very different than when we might have had the job, right? We still do work. We can't imagine going necessarily back to that structure. Those are all part of how we navigate the world and how we look at things and how we work. And so those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. We come from those with all of the things that the way we were raised. If our parents absolutely believed that paid work was how you had financial security, and if you put financial security as one of like your top priorities in life, then certainly like you can't imagine leaving paid work. Not a good thing or a bad thing, just a thing to recognize it is a choice, and maybe it's a good choice for you, or maybe there's something else. If you're enjoying your work, if you feel engaged and productive and valued, then absolutely. Why would you contradict that? On the other hand, when we were talking earlier, I was talking about a friend of mine who has what we call white coat syndrome, right? When he goes and he sees a doctor in a white coat, he has almost a panic attack. His blood pressure goes up. His breathing gets very shallow. They can't take his blood pressure at that time because it's just way too high because he's had some experiences when he was younger. And so, he does much better in a clinical setting where doctors might be wearing polo shirts or other kinds of jackets that maybe have the clinic name on it, but they are not necessarily wearing the traditional white coat of a doctor. It is a cognitive bias on his part that he has those impressions and interactions. He understands it's irrational. And yet for him to get the kind of medical care he needs, right, he has to work with that. He's getting better. He recognizes that medical care is important. And so he's starting to say he knows where that comes from and how he might start to work with it to do something different.
Yeah. So once we can recognize that we are working within our own biases, then we can start to pick apart and see where there might be holes in our own bias or where it's supporting us. In his case, he's recognizing it's irrational. He's still experiencing it. So he's starting to take steps as to like, okay, this is ingrained in me, but I can find workarounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So finding workarounds or even having that conversation with ourselves of, wow, this came about because of these experiences. And those experiences are done. And that's where things like journaling and some self-reflection, if we want to start to change things, having some tools to be able to do that and be able to do some, for lack of a better term, some self-soothing or some self-regulation, he may still find himself one day in a clinical setting where there are lots of people with white coats on. So if he can start to develop some skills now that are like, okay, the nice men and women in the white coats are here to help me. And he can start to change that narrative that got built in his mind so many years ago. Having neuroplasticity is such a gift because it means that we can, through some intentional repetition and action, we can actually change the neural pathways that anchor these beliefs and develop a new set of tools and skills to move forward with.
Now, what about an example? If somebody has a diagnosis or an illness or some health experience that they're going through and they have seen other examples of what that looks like in other people. Mm-hmm. And so they therefore assume that is going to be their experience. Is that a bias?
It is. And I was actually just reading about it the other day, and unfortunately I was reading a whole bunch of stuff, so I don't remember specifically which one it is. But this tendency to have that sort of single example or one of to generalize from a specific incident is a bias, right? And so we often see it showing up in, like, I might say, well, my friend has lupus of some kind, and this is how she shows up in the world. And so I might assume all people who have lupus look like that, act like that, experience that, are interacting in the world with the way that this person I know is. When in reality, like, this is a condition that shows up in lots of different ways in different people. It can vary greatly depending on your environment, where you're at in your journey and all of those sorts of things. So we lean to what we know. So if everyone we know is in a certain space, we assume that's how everything is. There is a tendency to overgeneralize and then make assumptions of, well, now I'm encountering these information. People are telling me, oh, try this. Oh, try that. And we're like, well, if that worked, why wouldn't those people be better? No, when we don't necessarily even know if they tried those things. And a little bit of, we are all an experiment of one. And we chatted about that earlier. our biology is so, like, we know so little about the human body. We know so much, and yet we know so little. There is a real, I think we can say, well, this may be how it is for most of the people in the studies that have been done so far, but we're constantly learning new information. We're constantly reevaluating how studies were structured, and did we really control for all the possible elements? And did we or did we not even experiment with some of alternative therapies? I love that there's so much more research being done around alternative therapies, and that people are able to start to do that. I think we live in a much better time for those sorts of things, but I think we still have an awful lot to learn.
I agree. And so that's another important point when it comes to cognitive bias is science isn't absolute. Science is not necessarily definitive. It's definitive for the moment, perhaps, but that never means that we aren't going to learn new things.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there wasn't science that was flawed. So I think that I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I guess I think that it's really important to recognize that and keep that open mind in spite of still believing in one pathway, maybe for health, so
Yeah.
that when new information comes to light, we can still allow ourselves to be open to exploring other possibilities.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that we tend to forget about science. We think that science has answers, like definitive answers. If we even think back to, like, we all learned about Einstein's theory of relativity, right? And we thought, oh, this is it, the ideal. And then many decades later, there's like, well, maybe not so much. We learn the best things we can with the information we have at the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that won't change over the years. And so I think it's one of the reasons. So I was a math teacher by trade for many years. I think we talked about that. One of the things that I really wish everybody could take a class in and understand is statistics, and being able to go to a scientific study and understand what it's really saying. Because I think a lot of times when these scientific studies get translated into the sort of more digestible media outlets that we tend to be able to follow, we don't always get the full picture or understand correlation versus causation and some of these sorts of things, even looking at study sites and being able to compare, well, this scientific study had this outcome and this scientific study had a contradictory outcome. Well, okay, so what was the size of the population? What were the conditions under which it was done? Was it a controlled study? How long did the study go on for? Like, there's a lot of aspects of a scientific study that can really vary how much confidence we might have in those outcomes. And then even with all of that, knowing somebody may come along 20 years from now and go, hey, wait a minute, I see this. And people are often then like, oh, well, let's revisit that. Let's maybe think about that in light of new information. So that in light of new information is really important with almost everything we do, because there really are very few absolutes for any of us.
I have to put a little jab in here about the whole, because science that was so popular just a few years ago, that just doesn't fly after this conversation, right?
Yeah. I think because science is a really incomplete statement, I think it's a great soundbite, like so many things. But there's like a whole slew of stuff that has to come after that, which is because science, based on what we know at this time, has shown this thing. This is the best information we have at this time. And I think it's like the difference between this is absolute truth versus the best information we have at this time. I think those are things that so often we want to get everybody on board with what we're trying to tell them. And I think sometimes it's easy to make some bad decisions on messaging that actually work against you instead of for you.
Agreed. And that really does go for the whole cognitive bias discussion, right? These things can work for us, can work against us, but we have to become aware so that we can determine which one's which.
And become
So,
curious about our own thinking and about how these other things are coming about in the world around us.
of course. Well, Andrea, I really look forward to continuing this conversation in future episodes. We are going to start diving in next time to specific cognitive biases so that we can help open your minds and help with that awareness factor so that you can determine for yourself if and when you fall into one of these biases and how to determine whether we should or not.
I look
So,
forward to it. Thank you, Holly.
absolutely. We'll see you again soon.
See you soon.
So let me ask you, did you recognize yourself in any of the biases that we talked about today, just in that patterning? I know I sure did. And as I stated in the episode, it pisses me off just a little bit because, of course, I want to be right about my own assumptions, right? We all do. But that's where these conversations are really important because if we're not even aware that we're biased, that we're falling into one of these biases that we will be talking about in future episodes, then we can't get out of it, right? We can't open our mind to other possibilities until we have some awareness. So that's what this series is going to be about, just developing your own awareness around your own cognitive biases and where that may be helping or hindering you in living your best life. So reach out to Andrea and I if you have any questions. And I look forward to continuing this series with you and with Andrea. See in the show notes where our first conversation was, so you can listen to that. I do ask for one little favor. Can you please like and subscribe to this podcast on whichever platform you enjoy listening in on? It really helps boost our show and get it out further to more ears that can use this information. Thank you so much for listening in, and I'll see you soon on the next episode of the Health Bridge podcast.